Good evening, everyone. Ranter is back to go into yet another one of his rambling diatribes on the politics of the day. Now, this one I kind of have sort of an impromptu thing about. I was on my usual social medias, on my Facebook group that my buddy Vin runs, from Vin and Sorry on YouTube. Check them out, they're awesome. Plug! Anyway. And we're having this conversation throughout these topics, and there's one on the weight of the voting in Texas. And I took a look at it. I went back and forth on it because a lot of what I saw reminded me so much of prior years of how certain efforts from certain political groups would push their agendas of voter suppression. You know, how you would hear the articles and stories about how voting places would somehow disappear, and because of gerrymandering, some districts that were more Democratic, somehow those voting places start to get farther and farther away. And usually it's politically based, obviously, but also a great deal of it was racial in origin, as to the certain people did not want to go out and vote in vast numbers and make it difficult for them to do so. So we saw a lot of it in the past few years of our elections, and to emphasize that, this is because usually I'm accused of derangement when it comes to Trump. This is not a Trump thing. This is voter suppression and all of this bullshit to prevent people and making it difficult for them to vote is something that's been happening pretty much a lot of these election cycles, at least for as long as I've been politically aware and active in politics, which goes back to the late 90s. Now, so when I first saw this conversation and I got into it, I took it from that point of view. My buddy Vin was in this conversation. We were going back and forth about it, and I started looking into it. And he said that I should do a video about it. Of course, he said it kind of snarkily, because I'm supposed to be railing on Trump, which I will, because I'm deranged. But when I look into this and look into the details, this was starting to piss me off. And so, what should a ranter do when a ranter gets pissed off? Well, he rants. So, I want to get into this with y'all. This is about Super Tuesday. This is about the wait that people had to do in certain counties in Texas. I had already posted an article about it a couple days ago. Well, a day ago, clearly. About this one guy who works 2 jobs, waited in line for 7 hours, still went to work at 1:30 in the morning, and considered it worth it. Okay? More. Time in. Now, what I'm going to go through is an article from the New York Times concerning this particular subject. Washington. For all the fears of foreign sabotage and security lapses in voting machines, the biggest nightmares to confront the election officials during the year's biggest primary balloting on Tuesday mostly proved more mundane. Unexpected number of voters at polling places that were unprepared to handle them. On a day when most voting went smoothly, the 2 largest states in the Super Tuesday elections, California and Texas, struggled with hours-long lines in some major cities and complaints from some voting rights groups that officials were seeking to reduce turnout for political reasons. The problems were particularly severe in Texas, a state with some of the nation's strictest voting requirements and lowest voter turnout. In the most notorious breakdown, some voters at Texas Southern University, a historically black institution in Houston, waited as long as 7 hours to cast a ballot. Some critics complained on Twitter and elsewhere that the delays amounted to voter suppression in a state where Republicans had been frequently sued, sometimes successfully, for trying to minimize Democratic power. But Texas elections are tightly controlled by local officials, not state ones. And the big cities like Houston and Austin, which had the biggest problems on Tuesday, those officials are Democrats, with scant reason to depress turnout in Democratic urban strongholds. Election officials said the long waits on Tuesday were largely explained by last-minute surges of undecided voters and glitches in the election procedures. Most notably were problems in Harris County, which includes Houston, where voting machines were divided equally between Democratic and Republican voters, but many more Democrats turned out to vote on Tuesday. Republican turnout was sapped by the lack of a seriously contested presidential primary. If only I could speak. But the party's voters did have choices in races for the House and Senate in an array of state and local offices. The imbalance stemmed from the county Republican Party's refusal to agree with Democrats to hold joint primary election in metropolitan Houston in which voters could cast ballots on any machine. All but a handful of the state's 254 counties held joint primaries. The result was long lines of Democratic voters at some polling places, even when the county election offices had deployed large numbers of voting machines and expected of a heavy turnout. The parties have agreed on polling locations and equipment allocations, said Roxanne Werner, the Community Relations Director for Diane Trotman, the Harris County Clerk. We do work with them, but ultimately, with a primary election, it's contingency on the parties. Harris County problems were heightened by the malfunctions in its aging fleet of voting machines. The county plans to replace the machines by 2021. Convenient. Now, California was suffering from this similarly. Many California voters also suffered long waits, particularly in Los Angeles, where the first majority deployment of the new $300 million voting system was dogged by glitches and created delays of up to 4 hours. The presidential campaign of Senator Bernie Sanders asked a federal court on Tuesday to keep polling places open an extra 2 hours for late voters. Pardon-moi? Timon. Alright, where was I? Oh yes, those sorts of problems and not deliberate efforts to drive down turnout were at the root of the problems seen on Tuesday, experts on election administration said. In some cities, purchases of new voting machines slowed the balloting as voters labored to apply the new technology to the state's notorious long ballots. All over the state, we saw a lot of late openings contributed to technological issues, said Anthony Gutierrez, the executive director of Common Cause Texas, which helped run a hotline that flagged voting problems. People were used to voting on the same machine for 2 decades, and there was going to be some training time required. We all saw what happened in Iowa and Nevada caucuses, said Matthew Wheel, the director of the election projects at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington. Those are party-run events. Primaries are better run, but clearly things happened in individual states that people didn't realize were going to happen. True. I wonder what happened. Some delays in both states may have stemmed from a switch in some places to so-called county-wide voting centers where anyone could cast a ballot regardless of where they live, rather than being restricted to voting at a single polling place. While the centers make voting more convenient, they also scramble the historical data that election offices had used to place voting machines where demand is highest. Some Texas cities were also hobbled by an unexpected high turnout. The state allowed 11 days of early voting, but in Houston, officials say, many Democrats waited until Election Day before settling on a choice in a widowing presidential field. In Bexar County, sorry if I'm butchering that, home to the fast-growing San Antonio, a crush of new arrivals from other states helped fuel the record turnout and slowed voting with their confusion over states' refusal to allow them to register on the spot, as is increasingly common elsewhere. And in Austin, where delays were more scattered, the American Statesman newspaper reported that 11 election officers refused to staff polling places for fear of it being infected with the coronavirus. Subtle. The most notorious delay occurred at Texas Southern in Houston, where one voter made national headlines by waiting 7 hours. That was the article I posted. Until after midnight before casting a ballot. Ms. Werner of the Harris County Clerk's Office said the campus was hosting a polling place for the first time in a presidential primary and was swamped by an election day turnout that exceeded the total from 11 days of early voting. The site allotted 10 voting machines to each party and eventually added 14 additional machines for the Democratic voters, she said. But of those who showed up on Tuesday, 1,132 voted in the Democratic primary, 68 voted for the Republican candidates. So, all right, so that's the official line we're getting, at least from this article from the New York Times. Is this something that we should have our confidence in and then nod our heads and says, okay, that makes sense? Maybe. It kind of makes sense. They did address the issue. But here's where the wrinkle is for some of us who look at this, especially given what happened in Iowa. We who take these deep dives into politics, either objectively and even through biased lenses, we are looking for telltale signs of there being some shenanigans. And one of the things that was kind of quirking us during the Super Tuesday was that Bernie Sanders was actually in the lead in Texas for a good long while before Biden slowly overcame him and then took it. For me, if I was someone on the Sanders campaign, I would take a good hard look at this and maybe consider doing an investigation on this. Because one of the things that I railed against, especially in 2016 and because of the Trump-Hillary election, was my problem with certain states that went to Trump at the margins because of third party. But you always had the stigma and the stench of voter registration issues, voter suppression, people playing whack-a-mole with voting places. We've seen articles of misinformation being put out where, vote on this day, not this day. And come over here to vote, but not over there where it's the actual spot. And we've seen articles where people were thrown off of buses that were supposed to go to voting places. So that's pretty skeevy. So in the backdrop of remembering all this, especially remembering the videos of long lines of voters going back and forth in Ohio, I see this story and I immediately click to that and thinking, oh well, this is another plot to screw over the voters, especially those voters who were Democratic, because that usually is usually the victims of this, voters in the Black community or just voters in general who are in these particular counties and districts who are finding themselves being screwed over and being told, no, the place that you were going normally, we don't do that no more. Go 10, 20 miles down the road if you really want to vote. Trying to make it harder and harder on people to do so. So it's again. Time in again. So we want to take this information that was being offered, that these people were blindsided by the turnout, that there were some compromises made of voting, certain amount of voting machines in certain places between the parties and so forth. You want to take the irregularity at face value and the explanation they give at the face value. You may. I don't see a problem for you to do so. The response for this is timely. No one was trying to necessarily make the appearance of them hiding something. But the argument is there that if not for these irregularities, and not for the frustration it must be for some people who were waiting in line for hours and hours and hours, and some that could have just given up, that maybe there was a difference because of that could flip the state one way or the other. That something a little bit more malicious is going on. Cite the obvious official findings of this. This isn't an issue of a local Republican government wanting to screw over Democratic voters. Not in this case. If this is our worst case scenario that we're entertaining right now, then this is Democrats screwing over Democrats for making sure Bernie doesn't win the state. Now, this was also happening in California, which Bernie won handily. Similar situations of larger turnout, few voting machines, few voting places that were not working as well as they should be. But unless you're going to make an argument that in California that was done in an effort to slow Bernie down, Bernie was inevitably going to win it. Biden wasn't even second in that line. He wasn't even third in that line. So you can't quite say that it was trying to boost him up because he wasn't getting boosted up from it. Texas is the one that is ripe with more suspicion. Now again, you want to take the official word on this, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, it sounds reasonable. It doesn't sound like how it sounded in Iowa, where it's like, for days, oh, we don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going on. And then we find out that that this app that was supposed to be helping them with their voting problems, or they're facilitating their voting, was a thing that was causing the problems. And then we find out that Pete Buttigieg donated money to this engineer firm that made the app, which made his very quick victory lap before there was any results a little suspicious. Texas isn't Iowa in that sense. But these irregularities that happened in Texas, you know, it is worth questioning. They weren't expecting such a large turnout. They make it clear that Texas is one of the states that has the lowest voter turnout for such a big state. Is that viable? Sure, that's viable. But I'm one of these people that doesn't take coincidences lightly. And had Bernie Sanders not been the front runner leading up to Super Tuesday, or at the very least, or at the very most, rather, leading up to South Carolina, he wasn't the front runner going into this with the delegate count, I wonder if we would have seen such problems in Texas. I don't know. We have, we who do these things, other people on YouTube who rant about politics, Vin Stories Middle America, where he does great deep dives into information and topics like this. We do question this. Sometimes from the biased point of view of, our politics, this is clashing with what we believe in and we think the fix is in. And in others, at least from my point of view, is that I take this and I post this right now because this pisses me off. For a very simple reason, because of my derangement, that I want us to have a unified force after the nomination to go against Donald Trump. If this was intended to happen maliciously in order to keep Bernie Sanders from winning the state and keeping his delegate count viable to give him a path beyond Super Tuesday, then that is not going to garner unity. The eye on the ball that I talked about last time is President Donald Trump being president. And no matter how much you want to be president of the United States, one of the things you want to do is defeat Donald Trump. And you want to give reasons why you want to defeat Donald Trump. It's hard to get into, oh, we finished that off and now we're on to him, when you can have half of your party, a young, vibrant part of the party that's going to be there long after the establishment and the people who are scared of socialism is gone. If this was done to keep that reign of power, keep Bernie Sanders away from the nomination, then shame on all of you because you are screwing us over. And I'm not saying this because I'm going to be totally anti-Biden and I'm going to bitch and moan about it if he gets a nomination. No, no, no. Because of, once again, my aforementioned derangement, I'm going to support whoever's the nominee against Donald Trump. Regardless of how bad their past is, because everyone that's coming in here is coming in with skeletons. And everyone who comes in here is coming in here tainted. No one, it's pissed me off at the start of all this because I talked about this before. It's kind of rambling because that's what ranting does. But you know, almost every one of these candidates who came up to run for president immediately had to apologize for something they'd said or did in their past. Biden has stuff in his past that people can righteously point to and say that's why they're not going to support him. From him going along with the people, the stupid 1970s segregationists who didn't want the bus to children, and he went along with that in a compromise, to his crime bill, which I don't even know if you can even find a justifiable reason that is righteous other than it being racially profiling, and it's like a quick fix to the problems that you caused for people that are suffering. Yeah, I was a teenager in the 90s. I saw the news, you know, the entertainment of the day, you know, talked about, you know, gang banging and racial violence and crack and all that shit. Yeah, that was in the ethers. We all knew about that. That doesn't justify draconian procedures and policies that harms innocent people, no matter what skin pigmentation they got. And then we hear about, you know, how this also led to like a little bit of money in the prison system that we've seen translate over the years from not only what was going on in the 90s that goes on to the 2000s. We find out that Jan Brewer's papers please law, where, you know, they went in Arizona, they had a policy that they started up where people better have their IDs on them at all times, or they might have to get arrested if they happen to look illegal. And gee, I wonder how someone looks illegal. I'm sure illegal people glow in the dark for you to quickly identify them and question them, because Lord knows if they happen to look, oh, I don't know, Hispanic. We've had an Hispanic population on this part of our continent before there were white people on this continent. People who were native before they were even learned the Spanish language. You know, those people that you look funny at because they speak in a different language than yours, and they're waiting to do the work that you don't want to do. So yeah, but then we find out from the Arizona law that Jan Brewer was actually getting kickbacks for the amount of people that she sends to prison. She got a little quota money from that. So whatever righteousness you thought that were there for the Papers, Please law in Arizona, much the same as the crime bill in the 90s, you look a little deeper, you always find there's a little incentive. And Biden had his hand on the crime bill, writing it, pushing it. Clinton's pushed it, using unfortunate, unnecessary bullshit terms like predators. You know, I imagine for some people, when it comes to the crime bill, if these people stopped and thought for a second to articulate what it means to put the crowbar separation of who you're referring to as predators. You're just simply saying predators, or you're referring to every single viable teenage young adult black male or female? Because that's what the crime bill 20 plus years later translates to. The racial profiling and arrest and unlawful incarceration of people who are innocent. If people have to deal with life in terms of generations of people that just expects to get harassed because they're just walking down a street, it doesn't matter if you want to arrest them. That's dehumanizing. And that keeps the wedge between us. Because as a 41-year-old Italian-Irish descended American, I have no instinct to look over my shoulder when a cop car comes. And it's unfortunate that any American of any race, skin pigmentation, ever has to do so. It is a sin that they have to do so. But not only they did then, it gets far worse. 10, 20 plus years later. I mean, don't forget, obviously, about the stop and frisk that Mike Bloomberg did in New York. One of my things why I support Black Lives Matter is the undue deaths of Americans, men, women, and children. It's just a darker shade on the skin pigmentation without just cause by certain members of our police force. And not only them who do these acts, but the justice system that protects them. Again, ranting. But all this stuff floats around and covers anyone that runs for president, anyone that becomes a front runner. That's when the microscope comes and we look into the past. Now, in a way like Bernie Sanders is, Joe Biden, none of this stuff was hidden. This is not a shocking revelation. This is not some hidden email or a hidden letter that just came to life. These are in public records. His involvement in pushing of the crime bill is public record. What he said about it is public record. What he did in the 70s is public record. His association and not being ashamed of making compromises with people who were clearly racist and clearly segregationists in order to push some bills through, in a 10,000 feet in the air look of this, yeah, that's kind of justifiable because that's how compromises are made and you get shit done. Because back then, unlike now, we tried not having the separate polarized camps where you either did your own thing, they did their own thing, never compromised, so therefore nothing gets done. Back then, at least they showed the illusion of compromise where they would get shit done, on the while that they had to swallow poison in dealing with people who you're diametrically opposed to socially and morally. But at least you're getting your bill through, right? You know, you rolled around in the mud, but at least the good thing that you wanted to get done was get done, right? The means to the end. I mean, that's what politics, unfortunately, has been. This is one of these common sense no-brainers that you understand regardless if it's in the civics book or not. And the other wrinkle about this, and this is something that Vin brought up in his own video on why Joe Biden still gets majority support of the black voters, regardless of his past, regardless of his involvement with the crime bill and the busing and all that stuff. He has his opinion on it, you know, and God bless him. I love him, but I kind of disagree with him on it just a little bit. Not all of it, because I see his point of view, but I look at it from a different point of view. Is that voters on any block, racial, social, whatever, they're not monolithic. I mean, that's a term that we throw out a lot in order to justify, hey, this is why they're voting that way. Why are they voting that way? Well, they're not monolithic. They can do whatever they want. My thing is that they're also people, any people, that do make the compromise, that do make that pragmatic choice. That, I hate what he did. What a scumbag he was doing that just then. But he's going to either get my policies through, he's going to put my judges in power and install them so that my political point of view gets defended in the courts. So while that is happening, I will make the compromise and put him in as president. And that was the motivations of people who voted for Donald Trump. So when people are taking the pragmatic choice of voting for someone who has a history, policy-wise, public statements, that is diametrically opposed to what people assume is, your issues because of your race or skin color, they also, I'm assuming, make the pragmatic choice. He did that shit in the 90s. I remember that shit in the 90s. I'm one of the people who is of age that would have been at threat because of the crime bill if I was a black American. I grew up during that time. I would be one of those people that the cops would be turning the cars around and taking a good hard look and wanting to question in front of other people, humiliating me, alienating me. But you know what? We will make excuses for it, obviously. We'll make the pragmatic choice because of whatever reasons we have. Because everyone's going to have reasons. Everyone comes up with reasons why they can justify it. Or those who just simply don't want to give you a justification. They don't want to give you shit. They don't want to explain themselves to you. Which is fair too. Let's make that clear. That's absolutely fair. It's nobody's business why you vote for anybody. You're completely allowed to ask you why. But you're allowed to say, I don't need to tell you. At all. None of your business. Part of free speech, both ways. But people can be pragmatic and take a pass like that if their motivation is to defeat Donald Trump and they think he's the best person to do it, regardless of the fact that Joe Biden, yes, is in decline. It would be dishonest of me to not say that. And the only hope is that if he somehow became the nominee and somehow became president of the United States, he rallies good people around him to help him, to facilitate being president. Because, and I neglected to mention this in the last video, we do not know what happens beyond the closed doors of the White House when presidents are in. We sometimes, after they're long gone from the White House, we'll get these expose books on what was like in the White House. It could have been a madhouse. It could have been a well-oiled machine. No one in the 1930s to 40s, outside of family and staff, close inner circles and politics, knew that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in a wheelchair. They orchestrated that beautifully to make sure he always looked like he was standing. There was always someone next to him to keep him up. He was able to drive because he had a hand-operated car. Because perception is reality. We know that from this president. Perception is reality. People didn't know that John F. Kennedy had Addison's disease. People did not know, though they did suspect, in a lot of the political cartoons and people's opinions at the time, that Ronald Reagan, into his second term, was also going into decline. So he had his support, he had his good people around him be a strong support system so that whenever he showed up on stage or showed up to make public statements, they were ready. They were ready to make him look as good as humanly possible, make sure he was mentally capable as humanly possible, to make sure the duration of time he was on, he was talking about anything, was at a proper length so that it didn't run off, it didn't look like he was sundowning, as unfortunately Joe Biden does at the latter parts of the debates that he goes through. And Donald Trump too, because he's also in decline. If you do not think he's in decline, then you are fooling yourselves. And this is not me being deranged against Donald Trump, because there's a lot of valid reasons to go after Donald Trump. His mental faculties, his emotional faculties, if anyone else was suffering from that, I would call it out, Democrat or Republican. If you bring up anything about Joe Biden and his decline, then at the same breath, you have to be prepared to get the counter from Donald Trump, because he's going through the exact same thing. And the only problem is that he does not have good people around him. He has sycophants around him that say, yes, sir. Anyone that tries to challenge him, he gets rid of. Or he mocks on Twitter. The only person, and here's the sin in all this, in our current political process, the only person that does not have true skeletons in the closet, policy-wise or word-wise, in a true sense, like Joe Biden does, is Bernie Sanders. His racial issues was that he was standing up for equality and rights, and he was going to prison, going to jail rather, not prison, but he was willing to go to jail to defend those rights. And this is where pragmatism slides into cynicism. When you know this guy is a good guy, that he stands up for people, that, as I said when I voted for him in the primary in 2016, and I also voted for him this time around, when I said, he's a mensch, why not? Even though I knew that Hillary was probably going to take Virginia, as I probably knew Biden was going to take Virginia, and he did, he is a good guy. And no matter how scary his socialist gulag policies of Medicare for all is, even if you're so fearful of his goddamn democratic socialism, as I said last time, he is just one guy. He's not going to turn the country socialist because he's president. And my other point from that last time was the Democratic Party is going to have to evolve. If we're not going to do in this cycle, then we will suffer the pain of Donald Trump for another 4 years, because that's the lesson you're going to have to learn. Instead of sabotaging viable people in order to keep your status quo establishment power. You're a 20th century concept in the 21st century. You are 20 years past the expiration date to worry about the things you're worrying about. There are people still in this race who are having media blackouts because they're not fitting the mold of an establishment Democrat. People that I don't necessarily agree with, but they need to have a fair shake, like Tulsi Gabbard. It's amazing how Elizabeth Warren gets out of the race today. We should have talked about that, but I wanted to be on this topic. And I'll talk about that later, maybe. I don't know. But she's gone, and she had delegates, some of them. She had a strong presence on the media. She's gone. Tulsi Gabbard, who was in the 3% basement, is not gone. Even though the media, from CNN to MSN, even Fox News, who's more friendly to her, only gives her crumbs off the table of time to speak to her. That's a viable voice that should have the proper and respectful amount of time to be discussed above for her policies, her point of views. Because I'll tell you what, there are Democrats and independents that listen to her and agree with her. And the last thing that we need, which once again is going to be one of those things that will get Donald Trump elected again, is alienating people that agree with us. There's something that I said a few videos back upon Bernie Sanders, and he wanted a litmus test on, I guess, on judges to make sure that every judge that they come up with the Supreme Court has to be pro-choice. Has to be. Has to be. I'm a pro-choice guy, so this is my point of view on that. That is a stupid thing to say, Mr. Sanders, because not every Democrat, and certainly, God knows, not every American Democrat or Republican is going to be pro-choice. And in an election like this, where you want all hands on deck, you do not alienate people. And there are pro-life Democrats that exist. There are pro-gun Democrats that exist. We're against gun control, as I'm for gun control. Because Democrats are not one flavor, which is why we keep getting this shit twisted. We're all not lockstep. We're all not one way. We do not have a progressive checklist. What we should be ideally doing is that we should be that big tent, absolutely, but we need to respect the difference of opinion within that tent. We should not have everyone agree with us all 100%, and if they don't, kick them out or alienate them. Be thankful you get 75% of agreement, and with that 25% of disagreement, respect. Nod your head. That is your opinion. I do not agree with it, but it's your opinion. I don't have to tell you. You have every right to it. And please stay in the tent. If this gets contested, if this nominee process gets contested at the convention, Donald Trump wins. If we do not have the unified voice, all in one, of all of us who agree or even disagree, but agree in the common goal, the common point, the eye on the ball, Donald Trump will win. With the prospects of Joe Biden being nominee, I've already seen on my social media so many memes, so many little GIFs, so many little snarky articles about his decline and making fun of it. Are you going to expect these people to be lining up to support Joe Biden? Because the DNC, you're not helping things by screwing people over to garner some loyalty to send to him. I know that there is a portion, large portion, that thinks no matter who it is, vote blue anyway because you're trying to get rid of Donald Trump. I understand that. I function in that thinking. But I also recognize that people don't think that way. And there are people in here who are not affected negatively by Donald Trump, that doesn't like the antics that he does, but because they haven't personally been affected by him, they'll just put the blinders on to the unqualified, disqualified nature of the man and see the machinations are done by the DNC against Bernie Sanders and go, you know what, screw you. I will vote third party. Or I will vote for Trump, just to fuck with you. And all of us who see the disgrace and the degeneration of our country because of this man, knowing that that could happen to us, and he gets reelected, that is not on them, the voters. That is not on them because they're pissed off. That is on the machinery that's going to be on the DNC, who did not embrace a popular candidate, that instead sabotages that candidate because he does not fit the mold that is 20 years past overdue. The Democratic Party has been evolving, as the Republican Party has been evolving, as I said in the last video. From 19th century on up, we've gone from an agrarian, pro-slavery, pro-Southern, Confederate, after the Confederacy, pro-Ku Klux Klan, pro-Jim Crow, pro-segregation, pro-separate water fucking fountains. And we took up the mantle of integration and civil rights and wanting everyone to be involved, wanting everyone to be represented, wanting everyone to be respected. We took that turn in the 20th century. And what we are now is not recognizable to what we started. And the same thing goes with the Republicans, because Lord knows there is no Lincoln Republican. There is no Eisenhower Republican. There is no Reagan Republican that represents now, because those who are vilified and ostracized. And if they dare have a different opinion against Trump or have a conscience to act that is in conflict with Trump, then he must be demonized, like Mitt Romney, as his very own niece does to him because she runs the RNC. It's not going to be the voters' fault if they're pissed off that the machinery cared more about their politics than the people, and for the centralized goal of removing Donald Trump as President of the United States by beating him lawfully in an election, beating his idealism, beating his personal ideology that the Republican Party has been enslaved to, that could actually save the Republican Party by his defeat. It won't be the voters' fault if he wins again. It will be the DNC's fault. It will be the media's fault for not playing it straight, as they should be, for hyping up fears of socialism, to hyping up nonsensical bullshit about people sitting on the board of gas companies. Like that matters when the other side's children gets millions and millions of dollars in trademarks from foreign powers and foreign hands for influence. So there you go. So yeah, that was a rambling. That just went off. That went off the rails. But that went off the rails in a good way, because that also needed to be said. So, in terms of the original topic, yeah, that was fucked up what happened in Texas. And if you buy the official story, I don't blame you, because again, they were timely in bringing this out, and their explanations does seem valid. But if you have an argument and a confusion and a question about it, that is also valid and that is also understandable. And questions need to be asked. And questions really need to be asked by the Sanders campaign towards this. Because if he lost at the margins, and if any of these issues was the cause of it, he has a right to complain. Because his path to get to the nomination without it being contested now is very, very slim. So, yeah. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, no matter how much passion and how much righteousness that he can come out with, for certain issues, Sanders does not fight. He should be fighting for this. But he doesn't. You should ask why, for a man who has legit bona fides in civil rights for years, why he does not garner more of the black vote that he does. He needs to ask that why. Not in a petty way, but in a what's going on kind of way. And he doesn't. And that's another shame about all this. Alright, guys. I am now 51 minutes in. I wasn't expecting to go that long, but I rant. That's what I do. And I'll be back again because the ranter rants, and his urge to rant is always rising. So is his derangement. And if you have a problem with that, that's a shame for the sea of Biden memes and whining and so forth. And just because someone points out the problems and the ills and things that are wrong, and you might call it derangement, is not something to be dismissed. Just because I am mentioning it repeatedly does not mean I'm wrong. And it's Maida. M-A-I-D-A. So, just for that. I'll see y'all later.